Hello, in this School Grad video, we're going to talk about antonyms. This is an important video for those of you who are preparing for GRE and GMAT exams in the verbal section. So antonyms are words that are opposite in meaning. So in the GRE and GMAT exams, you will come across a lot of words. Sometimes you have to guess their synonyms, which are words of the same meaning, and sometimes antonyms. So we're going to take more than 100 examples, and I'm going to show you how to identify the roots and the meaning of some words, even if you've never heard of those words before. So I'm going to teach you some techniques about how to guess the antonyms based on the 4 multiple choices available. So this is a very important topic for those of you who are preparing for the verbal sections, and let's take a look at some antonyms. So the first one, taciturn. So let's assume you've never heard of this word before, and you have these 4 options and you have to guess the antonyms. Loquacious, stressful, discursive, and straight. How would you possibly guess the antonym? So taciturn, you might be inclined to think that it has something to do with turning or curves, but it's really nothing to do with something that's curvaceous or with a lot of turns or bends. So tacit, if you've heard of that word, it means very quiet and one who talks very less. So based on the word tacit, you can probably guess the adjective taciturn. And loquacious means very talkative. So the opposite of taciturn is loquacious. So the word here, straight, is given kind of to confuse you. You might be tempted to think that taciturn is something that bends and curves a lot, so the opposite might be something like a straight line, but that's just to kind of confuse you. So it's nothing to do with stressful or not stressful. It's about being talkative or quiet nature. So the opposite of taciturn is loquacious. Embellished. The 4 options are concise, plain, illiterate, and polite. So if you've never heard of the word embellished, well, embellished means jeweled, ornate, something that's very highly decorated. So remember the root word here, bell. So think of like a Christmas tree with a lot of bells on it. Those are like decorations, right? So if you think of embellished, it's something which is very well decorated. So that's how I remember this word. So embellished means I think of a Christmas tree with a lot of bells and decorations. Embellished means decorated. So the opposite is something which is not decorated, that is plain. Plain or unadorned. So it's nothing to do with being literate or illiterate, and embellished has nothing to do with being polite, courteous or not courteous. It's nothing to do with being concise or verbose. So embellished means decorated, and the opposite is plain or unadorned. Mellifluous. The 4 options are loud, soothing, meticulous, and abrasive. So mellifluous means something that's pleasant or soothing. So even if you've never heard of this term before, think of something like mellow. Mellow means usually someone who's very peaceful and who's kind of soothing and who is not quarrelsome. Based on the word mellow, or you can think about mellifluous means something very pleasant, something soothing. So the opposite of mellifluous is abrasive. So mellifluous is more about being pleasant. It's not about being soft. So you might be inclined to pick loud as the opposite. So the opposite of mellifluous is not loud, it's like abrasive. Abrasive is when you rub somebody and when you're bickering and it's like quarrelsome. That's what abrasive means. So mellifluous doesn't necessarily have to be very soft, but then it's something very pleasant, something that triggers off a pleasant emotion in you. So the opposite of mellifluous is abrasive, and mellifluous means soothing. So these are like synonyms, not the antonyms. Wise guy. So the four options are for antonyms: jester, thief, scholar, and dullhead. So you might be inclined to think that a wise guy is like a scholar, someone who is really brilliant. But it's actually one of the strangest things about English language, that some words, they're actually opposite in meaning to what they might seem like. A wise guy is a fool, a simpleton. A wise guy is not a wise person. So the opposite of wise guy would be a scholar. But if they had like a wise person here, then he would be a truly wise person. But a wise guy is a colloquial term for a fool. So opposite is not dullhead. In fact, a wise guy is a dullhead. And the opposite of wise guy is scholar. Next one is prolix. So the four options are expeditious, thrift-oriented, acute, and illustrious. Prolix means delayed or protracted. Something that has been delayed for a long time is prolix. So the opposite of that would be expeditious. So if you're writing a letter to someone, or after the interview, if someone is not giving you feedback, you might have used this term expedite. To expedite means to make something faster. So in my emails I would write to people like the HR managers. I would say, I remember I gave you this interview last week and we still haven't got the results. So is there anything I can do to expedite this process? Or if somebody is taking a long time in responding to your emails or something, or in doing performing a task, you can ask them, what can we do to expedite this? Means how can we make it faster? So expedite is the root word, and based on expedite, expeditious means fast. Prolix means delayed, and the opposite is expeditious or fast. Famished. The four options are established, satiated, published, and drafted. Famished means hungry. So the opposite of hungry is full or satiated. Satiated means something which is saturated. When you're full, you're satiated, satisfied. That's what satiated means. So opposite of famished is satiated. So it's famished sounds somewhat like, say, demolished or something. So you might be inclined to pick the opposite as established. But famished means hungry, and the opposite is satiated. Stoke. The four options are erase, acquit, smother, and straighten. To stoke means to fuel the fire or increase the intensity of something. Like, literally when there is like a fireplace, you stoke it by adding, fuel, or by, poking the fire so it, becomes more intense. So you can also probably, literally stoke an argument or stoke something to make it more intense. The opposite of stoke is to smother or extinguish a fire. So to smother is like when you put off a fire. Like for example, the rhinoceros stamps out a fire, smothers the fire. So if there is a fire, sometimes you put a blanket over it to smother it. To smother means to put off the fire, to extinguish. So the opposite of stoke is smother. Baroque. So baroque means ornate or jeweled. The four options are intricate, sonorous, artificial, unadorned. So if you've never heard of the word baroque, you might be inclined to think that baroque is something to do with a baron, or with a battle, or maybe something to do with power, something like the powers that a baron has, or something like that. But a baroque is nothing to do with a baron. Baroque means ornate or jeweled. It's the same as embellished, with a lot of jewels. So the opposite of baroque is unadorned. The next word is pulchritude. The four options are efficiency, veracity, inelegance, and intelligence. So pulchritude means beauty. The way I remember it is, when I think of pulchritude, I think of like a peacock with all the feathers and that somehow reminds me of the word pulchritude. So it means beautiful. Pulchritude is beauty, it's a noun. And the opposite of pulchritude is inelegance or ugliness. So, we all know that elegant means beautiful, and the opposite of elegant is inelegant. Inelegant is ugly. Opposite of pulchritude is ugliness or inelegance. Predilection. So predilection means fondness, inclination for someone or something. And the four options are clarity, inclusion, disinterest, or postponement. So, if you have never heard of the word predilection, it might seem like a predisposition or a premonition of something is going to happen, or it might seem like predilection means, it seems to me, if I've never heard of this word before, I would think of predilection means like a predisposition. I mean, you already have an inclination towards something or a fondness for something. So based on that, I would think that predilection somehow makes you feel like you're inclined towards a particular outcome. Predilection means a fondness or inclination for someone or something. And what would be the opposite of, being, if there's like two sides and you're fond of one side, what would be the opposite of that? The opposite is when you're unbiased, when you're unprejudiced. It means you're not picking any sides. You have no particular fondness or inclination for either side. So the opposite would be unbiased or impartial. So disinterest means impartial. So disinterested is very different from uninterested. Uninterested means lack of interest, but disinterested means when you don't take sides, when you're impartial. So predilection means a fondness. Disinterest means unbiased. The opposite of predilection is disinterest. So just because there is a pre over here, you might be inclined to pick something that has a post over here. Like there is a pre-session and post-session, right? So usually people think the opposite of pre is post. But in this case, the opposite of predilection is not postponement. So make sure you don't fall into these traps in these exams. Sometimes these words are deliberately included as options just to make you confused. Pugnacious. The four options are timid, honest, belligerent, and respectable. So pugnacious means quarrelsome or belligerent. So the way I would remember this word is, think of like a pug. It somehow reminds me of like the bulldog, right? Quarrelsome. When I think of pug, I think of the bulldog, okay? And it's quarrelsome and, bitchy and, like a dog. So pugnacious means quarrelsome, belligerent. And the opposite of that is timid or docile or nice and kind. So that is the opposite. In fact, pugnacious and belligerent are synonyms. So remember, sometimes I've seen this happen to students, like in the GRE GMAT exams. If they're asked to pick antonyms, they look at the word and they try to guess the meaning, and then among the four options they find a word that is similar in meaning and they pick that word. They forget that they have to pick the word opposite in meaning. So sometimes they give you a word which is almost the same in meaning, just to confuse you, and some students get confused, and instead of picking the antonym, they pick the synonyms. So watch out for this trap. Clement. Four options are impure, disintegrate, harsh, and active. So clement means friendly and kind. So opposite of that is harsh. So how I would remember this is, think of Clement Attlee. He was a very friendly British envoy to India. So, India was ruled by the British, and there were all these people. Some of them were not so nice to Indians, and some of them were really nice. They brought about a lot of reform. They were friends of Indians, and they tried to introduce education and societal reform. So Clement Attlee was one of the persons who was known to be very friendly and nice. So Clement actually means, you know, friendly, nice, and kind. So his name was Clement Attlee. So his name is probably something nice, right? So opposite of clement is harsh. So don't mistake clement for cement. It sounds like cement. So you might be tempted to pick disintegrate as the opposite. Some people think clement might be, oh, it might be something like cement, something that bonds stuff together. So the opposite might be to, take stuff apart or disintegrate. But it's nothing like that. The opposite of clement is harsh. Spendthrift. Opposite, we have four options: prodigal, fastidious, provident, and profound. So a spendthrift is one who spends excessively recklessly. So remember that a lot of people know the meaning of the word thrifty. Thrifty means one who's careful in spending, thrift oriented. But spendthrift is the opposite of thrifty. Spendthrift means one who wastes all his money, spends recklessly. So the opposite of spendthrift is one who's provident. So provident, think of like provident fund, like at the time of retirement. So every month you put in a part of your salary in the provident fund. At the time of retirement you get to, or when you leave the company you can, take all the money as the provident fund, right? It's like a savings. So provident means very careful, judicious. So opposite of spendthrift is provident. Jaundiced. Jaundice means biased or prejudiced. So the opposite of jaundice, we have four options: healthy, reddish, covetous, and unprejudiced. So the moment you see jaundiced, if you don't know what the word means, what would you probably think about? We all know that when somebody suffers from jaundice, their eyes are yellow and they see the world as yellow, something like that, right? So you might be, and we all know jaundice is a disease. It's a illness of the liver. So the opposite of jaundice, you would pick either healthy, or you might be inclined to pick reddish because it seems like the opposite of yellow. So you might be inclined to pick one of these, but no. Jaundiced means biased or prejudiced. It means you don't see things with an impartial, unbiased outlook. You're jaundiced means you're somehow, not seeing the right picture. So you're somehow prejudiced and taking sides, and you have an inclination towards something. So jaundiced. Opposite is unprejudiced or disinterested or impartial. Opposite of jaundiced is unprejudiced. Ennui. So four options are diffidence, buoyancy, onset, and encourage. So ennui means sadness or depression. And the opposite of that is buoyancy or liveliness. So the moment you look at buoyancy, you're probably going to think about the buoyant force of water. We all know that water offers an upward thrust, and that's what enables people to swim easily in deep water. We all know what buoyant force is. So the moment you think of buoyancy, you think about like the force in physics. No, but in literature, buoyancy means liveliness, cheerfulness, with enthusiasm. So opposite of ennui is buoyancy. And ennui is nothing to do with the end of something. If you've never heard of this word before, you might be tempted to think that ennui means, the end of a project, or end of the world, or end of something. It sounds like end, right? Because it starts with an en. So ennui doesn't mean the end of something, okay? Ennui means sadness or depression. Opposite is buoyancy. Feasible. So four options are terrible, inedible, impracticable, and audible. So feasible means possible, doable. The opposite of feasible is impracticable, means it's not doable, it's not practical, not pragmatic. So feasible is nothing to do with feasting. Just in case you've never heard of this word, you might be inclined to pick inedible, because you somehow think, you might be inclined to think that feasible, oh, it might be something like a feast. something like, a lot of good food. So opposite is probably something you can't eat, inedible, but that's not true. Feasible means doable, possible, and the opposite is impossible or impracticable. Platitude. 4 options are conciseness, poverty, diaphanity, and humility. Platitude means being commonplace or cliched. So, when something is not exquisite or exotic or something unusual, it's very cliched, it's commonplace. So, that's platitude. And the opposite of that is diaphanity, means elegance or subtlety. Something that's unusual, something very subtle, something very elegant is diaphanate. Okay, so the diaphanity means elegance, and the opposite of that is platitude, or means something very commonplace. So platitude sometimes seems like attitude. You might think, oh, somebody has an attitude problem, and the opposite of that might be like humility or humbleness. So you might be inclined to pick this, but platitude is nothing to do with attitude. Platitude means the commonplace, something very common. Opposite is diaphanity, and that is something very exquisite and elegant. Galvanic. 4 options are moony, broad-minded, congenial, and restless. So galvanic means excitable, forceful. And the opposite of that is moony or emotionless or dreamy or relaxed. So think about the moon. When you think about the moon, what do you think of? Something like pleasant moonlight, something that's soft white light, and something in the night quiet and pleasant with the moonbeams and everything. So when you think of moon, you somehow think of something pleasant and relaxed. And the opposite, moony is emotionless, dreamy, relaxed. And the opposite of moony is galvanic, that is forceful, excitable. Okay? So galvanic has nothing to do with being quarrelsome or something. It's about being excited, dynamic, something like that. So you might be tempted to pick congenial. Congenial means friendly, but it's nothing to do with being friendly. It's about being dreamy and relaxed. The opposite is relaxed. Galvanic is like excited, excitable. Consternation. 4 options are pervasiveness, confidence, singularity, and popularity. Consternation means dismay or distress or sorrow or like disappointment. And the opposite of that, opposite of consternation is assurance or confidence. So this is probably kind of hard to remember, right? If you've never heard of the word consternation before, you probably think consternation is something to do with being stern or strict, because it's got stern in it. So you might think consternation is someone strict or whatever, and the opposite of that, someone strict and aloof, the opposite of that might be like popularity, but that's not true. Or you might think a consternation is something like a constellation of stars, or something like that, a group of or set of something. So the opposite of that would be like a single element, right? So you might think it's a singularity or something. That's not true either. So consternation means distress. You have to find a way to remember it. But consternation means dismay, distress. And the opposite of that is confidence. Captious. The 4 options are honest, laudatory, exonerated, and silent. So captious means critical, irritable, nitpicking. So the opposite of that is encouraging or laudatory. Laudatory means when you praise someone, you're being encouraging. So think about the word applaud. We all know what it is to applaud, is to clap and encourage someone, right? So based on that, laudatory is like when you cheer someone up, you encourage them, praise them. And captious means when you're being criticizing someone, critical, irritable, you're somehow, nitpicking and annoying the other person. So the opposite of captious is laudatory. Captious has nothing to do with being dishonest. So opposite of captious is laudatory, irritable and encouraging. So these are the opposites. Judicious, 4 options: unscrupulous, vicious, outgoing, inordinate. So judicious means restrained, moderate, someone who is thrift oriented, who uses his judgment. So opposite of judicious is extravagant or inordinate. Inordinate means one who is extravagant, reckless in spending, something that's over budget. So opposite of judicious is inordinate. So you might be tempted to pick unscrupulous sometimes. So that's not true because they're almost kind of similar in meaning. So judicious is thrift oriented, inordinate is extravagant. So that's how you should probably remember it. Bounteous. Bounteous means kind, friendly, flourishing. Opposite is rancorous. So bounteous, we have 4 options: sanguine, fugacious, propitious, and rancorous. So bounteous, it's nothing to do with like being bouncing or lively, but bounteous means, think about the word abound. So something abounding in wealth or abounding in greenery. Abound means to have a lot of something. Bounteous means flourishing, something that's doing really well, kind and friendly. That's what bounteous means. And the opposite is rancorous, means it's like rotten or diseased, or like someone who's acerbic, angry, who is not friendly. Okay, so rancor, think about like in science we've all studied about butter getting rancid after a while. It gets spoiled, right? The kind of the obnoxious smell and the taste, it gets rancid. So rancor is a noun form of rancid. Rancorous means like something spoiled, rotten, something like that. And the opposite is bounteous or friendly. The next word in this list is miasmatic. Miasmatic means poisonous or dangerous. And the 4 options are rhapsodic, morose, prescient, and auspicious. So miasmatic sounds something like mesmerizing, but it's nothing to do with mesmerizing. Miasmatic means poisonous, dangerous. So be careful not to fall into these traps. Suppose you have never heard of this word before. You might be inclined to think miasmatic sounds like charismatic, but it's nothing to do with charisma, nothing to do with mesmerizing. Miasmatic means poisonous, dangerous. And the opposite of that is auspicious or beneficial. So rhapsodic means enthusiastic, but it's not necessarily auspicious. Rhapsodic means something like enthusiastic, but it doesn't necessarily mean something beneficial or auspicious. So opposite of miasmatic is auspicious. Hornswoggle. The 4 options are suave, lackadaisical, bamboozle, and talk turkey. Now this is interesting. Now let's assume you have never heard of this word hornswoggle before. What does it sound like? Hornswoggle? I would somehow think like it means bullshit, or it means something like when you're lying. That's what I would guess. And hornswoggle actually means to cheat or to confuse someone. It has a negative connotation to it. Okay, so hornswoggle means to confuse or to cheat someone. And the opposite of that is to talk turkey. So to talk turkey means to talk honestly. This would have been a little difficult to guess. So to bamboozle actually means the same as hornswoggle. It's like, to confuse someone, or to talk rubbish or talk absurd. But lackadaisical means lethargic, without energy, but then, or something like lazy. But hornswoggle is to cheat someone, and to talk turkey To talk turkey, remember, means to talk honest. So the opposite of Hornswoggle is to talk turkey. Truculent. The four options are moribund, parched, urbane, and impoverished. Truculent means hostile, rude, or impolite. So, if you've never heard of truculent before, it somehow sounds like succulent, right? You may think it's like a sponge, something that absorbs a lot of water, sucks or something. That's what it sounds like, right? But truculent is nothing to do with succulent. Truculent means hostile, rude, impolite. I don't know how you would remember it, but I would somehow think maybe truculent, I would think of maybe Donald Trump. I don't know. Well, he's not known to be the most, polite person, so. Well, that's just the way I would remember it. I'm just saying it's just my personal tactic. So think about like a person whom you know, or an object or something that reminds you of this word. So truculent means hostile, rude, impolite. Opposite is urbane or polished. So urbane is nothing to do with living in a city. It's nothing to do with urban life. Urbane means polished. So truculent is impolite and urbane is polite. Parched means dry. So this was done to confuse people actually. Parched means, when it's thirsty or dry or arid. So you might think truculent sounds like succulent. So you might think it's with a place with a lot of water or vegetation or plants or something, and the opposite is parched. You might be tempted to think, but that's not true. Truculent means rude. Opposite is urbane, that is polite. Artful means cunning or deceptive. And the four options are diplomatic, creative, obsequious, and scrupulous. So if you have never heard of the word artful before, you might be tempted to think that artful means artistic or talented. But artful is nothing to do with being talented or artistic or creative. Artful has a negative connotation to it. Artful means cunning or deceptive. And so the way I would remember it is, when I read this book, Oliver Twist, there was a character in it called the Artful Dodger. So that's the way I remember it. The Artful Dodger was a cunning person. So artful means cunning or deceptive. So the opposite of artful is scrupulous. Scrupulous means honest. Unscrupulous means dishonest. So artful is nothing to do with being diplomatic or not diplomatic either. Artful is nothing to do with creative. Obsequious means when you're overly being servile to someone, when you're trying to be like flattering someone, trying to curry favors or something. So it's nothing to do with the opposite of obsequious either. Scrupulous is honest, and the opposite of that is cunning or crooked or deceptive. So scrupulous, opposite is artful. Bourgeois. So this is like a French word. So remember the pronunciation is bourgeois. And the four options are avant-garde, preponderant, ineluctable, and cabalistic. Bourgeois means commonplace or cliched. And the opposite is avant-garde, that is innovative. So you have to familiarize yourself not just with English word, but also English words of foreign origin, like English words especially of French and Latin origin. So a lot of these terms might be asked in the GRE GMAT exams, and you must be familiar with these terms. So cabalistic means mysterious. It's nothing to do with a cabaret or anything. Cabalistic means mysterious. Ineluctable means inevitable. And preponderant means predominant. Bourgeois is commonplace or cliched, and the opposite is avant-garde or innovative. Serendipity. The four options are temerity, cruelty, courage, and inauspiciousness. So serendipity means luck, fluke, blessing. So when something happens by fluke or by chance, or when somebody is like lucky they have blessings, that is serendipity. Opposite is bad luck or inauspiciousness. So if an item brings you bad luck, that's inauspicious, right? Inauspiciousness is something bad, and the opposite is serendipity. So serendipity is nothing to do with having pity for someone. So if you've never heard of the word serendipity before, so what would you think? Oh, it has pity at the end, so maybe serendipity means like kindness or pity or sympathy. And you might be tempted to pick the opposite as cruelty. So, or you might think the opposite is like courage. The serendipity somehow seems like meek and timid. But no, serendipity means good luck. And the opposite is inauspiciousness. Quotidian. 4 options are tabloid, refractory, scandalous, and authored. Quotidian means commonplace, ordinary, something that happens daily. It's almost like cliche, something that happens daily, commonplace thing. That's what is quotidian. So if you have never heard of the word quotidian before, you might think it's something quote-worthy, right? Quote, because it has quote in the beginning. So you might think quotidian is something like something that you can quote to someone. Something like that is praiseworthy, or something. Quotidian means famous. You might be inclined to think that way, but it is not. Quotidian means something that's commonplace, meaning it's quoted every day. Think about it that way. It's quoted so often, like something cliched. So if there's riots happening in a war-torn area, it's kind of quotidian. It's nothing unusual. But if everything is peaceful and suddenly there is a riot, then that's something, unusual. So quotidian means it's quoted so often, it's commonplace, it's cliched. It happens daily. So next word in our list is artful. So the 4 options are diplomatic, creative, obsequious, and scrupulous. Artful means cunning or deceptive. So if you've never heard of the word artful before, you might be tempted to think that artful means artistic or talented. It somehow sounds like artistic. But artful is actually nothing to do with being talented. Artful means cunning, crooked, deceptive. The way I remember it is, in the book Oliver Twist, there was this character, the Artful Dodger. He was a cunning person. So, Artful Dodger, that's how I remember it. Artful means cunning. The opposite is scrupulous. Scrupulous means honest. Unscrupulous is dishonest. So, artful has nothing to do with being diplomatic or not diplomatic. It's nothing to do with creative. Obsequious means when you are servile and you flatter someone to win favors or something. So, artful has nothing to do with that. Artful means cunning, and the opposite is scrupulous or honest. Next word is bourgeois. Bourgeois is a French word, and the 4 options are avant-garde, preponderant, ineluctable, and cabalistic. Bourgeois means commonplace or cliched, and the opposite of that is avant-garde or innovative. So cabalistic means mysterious. So cabalistic sounds like cabaret somehow, but it's nothing to do with the cabaret. Cabalistic means mysterious. Ineluctable means inevitable. And preponderant means predominant. Bourgeois is commonplace, and avant-garde means innovative or something unusual. Serendipity. 4 options are temerity, cruelty, courage, and inauspiciousness. So if you've never heard of the word serendipity, you might somehow think serendipity, it's got pity in the end. So it's something to do with sympathy or pity or compassion. It's nothing to do with pity. So serendipity, you might be inclined, tempted to think that it's something to do with pity, and you might pick the opposite as cruelty, but it's nothing to do with that. Or it's got serene in the beginning. So you might think, serendipity is something to do with being serene or calm or peaceful or timid, and you might think the opposite is like, courage, or you might somehow think it's temerity or something. But no, Serendipity means good luck. So when you think of serendipity, think of like an object that brings you good luck. Like say there's a laughing Buddha in your house. It's supposed to be auspicious, brings you good luck. Serendipity means good luck or something auspicious. And the opposite is inauspiciousness. Quotidian. The four options are tabloid, refractory, scandalous, and authored. So if you've never heard of the word quotidian before, you might somehow think quotidian means something that's quote-worthy, something that's praiseworthy, something famous, something popular. But quotidian is actually the opposite. It's something so commonplace and cliched and ordinary, something that happens daily. Think of it this way. Quotidian is something that is quoted so often that it's cliched and it's so commonplace. For example, if there's a war going on somewhere and then there's some riots happening somewhere, it's quotidian, it's commonplace. But if everything is peaceful and suddenly there's a riot, that's something unusual. Quotidian means it's quoted so often, it's commonplace. That's what it means. Think of it that way. Opposite of quotidian is tabloid or sensational or spectacular. Tabloid means something that goes out in the magazine, in the headlines, and something that makes headlines, something that's newsworthy, and something that's sensational, spectacular. So the opposite of quotidian is tabloid. And refractory means headstrong. So refractory is nothing to do with refraction or diffraction or anything in physics. Refractory means headstrong, thick-headed, something like that. And some people might be tempted to think quotidian means something that's quoted or verbal, and the opposite, they might be inclined to pick something that's authored, means something that's in writing. But no, quotidian means it's so commonplace, and the opposite is something spectacular, something sensational. So quotidian opposite is tabloid. Fecund. Fecund means fertile or fruitful. So the four options are stalwart, effete, plebeian, and immaculate. So the opposite of fertile is sterile or effete over here. So sometimes when you look at fecund, if you have never heard of that word before, you might be inclined to think that fecund means something to do with feces or dirt or filth. Or you might think it's something to do with evil or something like that. But no. You might think fecund is something dirty, and you might think the opposite is immaculate. Immaculate is like spotless, clean, pure. But that's not true. So don't fall into these traps, okay? Fecund is fertile. Remember, starts with an FE and an FE. So think about fecund is fertile, okay? And the opposite is effete or sterile. That is something that doesn't produce results. Sybaritic. Four options are profound, febrile, sheepish, and ingenuous. So sybaritic means cunning or dishonest. So we're talking about sybaritic. If you've never heard of this word before, what would you think of? When you think about sybaritic, you probably think about like Siberia, you think about it being cold, being remote. I don't know. If you've never heard of that word before, what would you think of? That's what I would think of. But sybaritic means cunning or dishonest. And the opposite is ingenuous or kind. So ingenuous has nothing to do with being a genius. Okay? So remember, the spelling is different, the meaning is very different. Okay? Ingenuous means kind. Kind of simple, naive, kind, without any deceit or trickery or cunning. So sybaritic is cunning, and the opposite is ingenuous. Febrile means hot. So even if you knew the meaning of febrile as hot, so if you thought like, sybaritic, probably something like Siberia, something very cold. So maybe the opposite is febrile or something hot. That's not true. So don't fall into these traps. Sometimes a word sounds like something, but it may not really mean this what it sounds like. So in GRE GMAT, you have to be very careful not to fall into these traps. These are common traps. So modish. 4 options are corpulent, stodgy, culpable, indisciplined. Modish means fashionable. So if you've never heard of this word before, I would still probably be able to guess it. Modish means something that is the mode that's happening these days. So it's probably something fashionable, something that's in thing, something like that. Opposite is plain, unfashionable, or stodgy. So stodgy is nothing to do with being strong, nothing to do with being stubborn, nothing to do with being stingy. Stodgy means unfashionable. So modish, opposite is stodgy. And sometimes you might think modish is something to do with following a particular mode, a method, being disciplined. It's nothing to do with that. And you might be opposite to, the opposite you might be tempted to pick as indisciplined. But modish is nothing to do with discipline or methodical. Modish means fashionable. And the opposite is stodgy or unfashionable. Caustic. Caustic means acerbic or hurtful. So 4 options are inefficient, lucrative, palliative, and effervescent. So the opposite is soothing or palliative. Caustic is acerbic or hurtful, and the opposite of that is soothing. Palliative. So hurtful and soothing. So that's the difference. Sometimes you might think caustic is like something that's it has a negative connotation to it. You might think it's something that causes poverty or causes inefficiency. And you might be tempted to pick the opposite as efficient, but then it's listed as inefficient, so you wouldn't pick that anyway. And I once had a friend who saw these options, and she somehow thought caustic somehow reminded her of something in cooking that would get burnt, and she thought the opposite must be like effervescent, something that bubbles. She somehow thought the opposite of caustic is effervescent, but no. Opposite of caustic is palliative or soothing. Sardonic. The 4 options are unethical, sensible, succinct, and gracious. Sardonic means nasty and disrespectful. So if I looked at the word sardonic, I would still think, even if I've never heard of this word before, I somehow would sense it has a negative connotation to it. And the opposite of that would be gracious and polite. So sardonic has some negative connotation to it. So I wouldn't pick unethical as the opposite. So it could be one of these 3. Sensible. Sensible, opposite sardonic. Probably. Let's think about it. And then I would think about succinct. Succinct means very concise. The opposite is like sardonic. Verbose, no, that's probably not true. So I would rule out succinct. I would rule out unethical. Even if I'd never heard of this word before. I'm just telling you how to deal with situations where you come across a word that you've never heard of before. So sardonic is like something nasty, something disrespectful. And gracious seems like really nice and polite. So I would probably pick gracious. Sensible, it's also something positive, but it's not the opposite of sardonic. Gracious is the better alternative. So I'm teaching you techniques about how to eliminate answers that are probably not going to work. And then you're left with 2 options or 1 option, and then you pick that as the antonym. Obtuse. 4 options: perceptive, skinny, narrow-minded, and easy. Obtuse means stupid and insensitive. So the opposite of that would be perceptive or intelligent. So you might be tempted to think, if you've never heard of the word obtuse before, if you don't know the meaning, you might think obtuse is something fat. It somehow sounds like obese, right? So you might think obtuse is fat and you think the opposite is skinny. But don't fall into these traps. Remember, obtuse is not obese. And you know, we all heard of like the term acute, right? So in geometry you've heard of like obtuse angle and acute angle. So think of it that way, okay? So an acute, the opposite is obtuse, right? So in real life, acute means something sharp, right? Something intelligent, something clever. Acute, intense. The opposite is obtuse, or something lethargic, lazy, stupid, something like that. So stupid, insensitive. So the opposite would be perceptive. Obtuse means stupid, okay? And the opposite is perceptive. It's nothing to do with a level of difficulty. Upshot. The four options are downtrodden, anticlimax, non-entity, and underdog. Upshot means end result, outcome, or a finish. So, if you've never heard of the word upshot before, upshot somehow sounds like a big shot, right? Oh, that guy's a big shot, he's rich, he's famous, he's influential. So you might be tempted to think upshot is big shot, and you might think the opposite as like downtrodden, or something like a non-entity. A non-entity means someone who doesn't matter, who has no value. And downtrodden means the oppressed, the poor. So don't fall into these traps. Upshot is not the same as big shot. The upshot means the end result, or the outcome, or the finish. So the opposite would be anticlimax. We all know that climax is the ending. So anticlimax is like, it's either the beginning or it's like something that happens in a way that you don't expect to happen. So that's an anticlimax. So opposite of upshot is anticlimax, or the beginning, or inception. So it's not underdog either, because underdog is like, someone who probably kind of like flatters someone or something. But don't fall into these traps. Upshot means the end result, and the opposite is anticlimax. SQ. Four options are demonize, propagate, swallow, and embrace. SQ means abandon or avoid. And the opposite is to embrace or to adopt. So if you come across this term SQ and you've never heard of this before, SQ, so you would think it's got a chew in there. So you might think it's something to do with chewing. And you might think the opposite is to swallow. Don't fall into these traps. SQ is nothing to do with chewing. And think of it as SQ means to abandon or to avoid. Think of it like when you chew something, like chewing gum, and then you spit it out, right? That's the way I would remember it. SQ, chew it and spit it out. So you abandon it, avoid. SQ means abandon, and the opposite is embrace. So that's the way I would probably remember it. Discipline. Opposite, we have four options: torture, chaos, command, and restlessness. So discipline can also be a verb, it can also be a noun. So we don't know in what sense they're using it. So discipline, the noun form, it means orderliness. So the opposite would be chaos or disorder. So, but also to discipline someone means to take action against them, to make them obedient. Sometimes you say like beat someone, impose, punish them for disciplining them. But that's the same as, almost like the same meaning as torture. So these are not opposite. And to command is like to praise someone. But the opposite of praise is not necessarily to, discipline someone or punish them. So what is the opposite of praise? So if you're like commending someone, you're praising them, what would be the opposite? You criticize them, condemn them, but you don't necessarily punish them, right? So discipline here refers to orderliness, and the opposite is chaos or complete disaster. I mean disorder. So insufflate. The four options are exudate, inflate, eradicate, and meditate. Insufflate means to inhale. So if you've never heard of this word before, insufflate, it somehow sounds like inflate, right? Because it's got the in and the flate at the end. So you might think insufflate, probably like inflate. So you might think it's something like inflate, but then inflate is listed as one of the options here for the antonyms. So even if you thought insufflate was inflate, you know the antonym is listed as inflate. So you might think, oh, so the antonym is here as inflate. So maybe insufflate means the opposite of inflate, that is to deflate. Maybe I should pick inflate. So insufflate has nothing to do with inflate. Insufflate means to inhale. And the opposite is exhale or exudate. So this is how you remember this. Latitude. The four options are forefront, aptitude, limitation, and longitude. So remember that latitude means freedom or space, and the opposite is a limitation, when something is confined to a particular limit. So latitude has nothing to do with longitude, okay? On like an atlas or the map of the earth, we all know a latitude is like a horizontal line and the longitude is a vertical line. So, but in this context, that's not the most appropriate answer. Latitude means freedom, space, and the opposite of latitude is limitation. Erudite. Four options are witty, dangerous, student, and naive. Erudite means scholarly or experienced, and the opposite is naive or novice. So erudite somehow sounds like elegant, sounds like a scholar. So I would guess it even if I'm, coming across this word for the first time. Erudite sounds like a scholar, that means scholarly. Opposite is a naive, so don't be tempted to pick student, because you think erudite is like a scholar, a professor, opposite is a student. That's not true. The opposite is naive or inexperienced. Adore. Four options: dispel, stupefy, ignore, and despise. Adore is to love someone, and the opposite is to hate someone or to despise. So this wasn't very difficult, I guess. So don't be tempted to pick ignore or dispel or stupefy. To adore is to really love and care for someone, and the opposite to despise is to hate. Maudlin. Maudlin means over emotional or like dramatic. So if you've never heard of this word before, when I came, think about Maudlin and think of like Marilyn Monroe. She was a very famous actress, right? So Maudlin somehow sounds like Marilyn. And think about over emotional, dramatic. Oh, and the four options here are colorful, obsequious, romantic, and earthy. So opposite is earthy. Earthy is natural. Instead of being dramatic, it's natural. So maudlin, opposite is earthy. Okay, so it's nothing to do with romantic or colorful. So over dramatic, over emotional, and natural. That's what it means. Sandbag. Four options are dissemble, donate, attack, and shortchange. To sandbag is to cheat or to swindle. Sometimes a sandbag can also be used in the context of providing balance to something. Like you sandbag it so it has a balance, it's not, unstable. to sandbag, opposite is to donate or to help. So sandbag in one sense can mean balance, but in another sense to sandbag means to cheat or swindle. And the opposite is to donate or to help. Dilatoriness. Four options are pertinacity, piety, short-sightedness, and restlessness. Dilatoriness means laziness. So if you've never heard of this word before, you would look at dilated and you think, when do your pupils get dilated? When you're excited or something, right? So you might think dilatoriness, something to do with being excited. No, that's not true. Dilatoriness means laziness. Opposite is